And now I have the pleasure of introducing Jenna Cacciola, and Jody Moore. Jenna is a licensed clinical psychologist from Indianapolis. Her clinical work focuses on providing comprehensive evaluations for children, adolescents, and adults within private practice and our residential placement settings. And many individuals with whom Jenna walks alongside are involved with the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, and or the adoption constellation. Jody is an international kinship adoptee from the United Kingdom, raised in a closed adoption, who suspected in her late 30s that she was autistic after finding her early childhood medical records. They'll be leading our panel discussion on intersecting identities, adopted persons who are or identify as autistic, ADHD, and or otherwise neurodivergent. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thanks so much for having us. So Jody's hoping to join us soon. I guess her laptop did that fun thing that happens to us sometimes, that it decides to do an update right when we want to get started with something. So I think she is just dealing with some technological stuff right now. So I will try to move things in a little bit slowly to hopefully build in time for the technology to work for us. Anyway, I was going to start off with just a brief little message. Oh, it looks like she is trying to get in right now. Since I'm co-host, I see that, Ty, so I will let her join. But yeah, so I just want to, something I always like to do just to kind of start the frame is by inviting people. I know I use a lot of fidgets and things like that for myself, just to kind of center and things like that. So if you need to fidget, get water, food, just keep yourself hydrated, take care of yourself, do what you need to do to hopefully, just feel centered and comfortable as you can today. Hey, Jody, can you hear us okay?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Log in. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was telling everybody that your computer did that lovely thing where it decides it just wants to do an update at the time that you absolutely don't want it to. So
yeah, right when I need it most. Yeah.
Oh, but that's always how it works. I feel like that happens for me before big meetings. So really all, and just as also just everyone, I want to pause. It's really nice to, meet you virtually, Jody. So Jody and I have corresponded via messenger and email a lot. So it's just, sorry, I'm just going to take a moment of joy that it's so exciting to see people, even though it's not fully in real life. But yeah, Jody, I had just kind of to buy us some time before we got started, had told people I have my own fidget sensory stuff to kind of play with, have water you just did, food, just inviting everyone to get as comfy in the space as possible. But yeah, and then the other thing Jody and I had discussed that we just wanted to, name, or I wanted to make sure that I named before we get, started here today and talking about, intersectionalities between the experiences of being adopted and, having some kind of neurodivergence, or wondering if there is neurodivergence, is, just to acknowledge how much of what we'll talk about tonight is that, it's individuals like Jody, and even though I haven't intersected or interacted with many of you, but just people that I've had the privilege of working with throughout the years are really the ones who have been my greatest teachers. So just to kind of have that as a frame for all of you when you're thinking about interacting, with providers. Certainly I had the privilege of being able to go to school, and with that it gives me some credentials, but really it's been that time since grad school, unlearning a lot of things that I did learn in grad school, and then having the ability to learn and walk side those with lived experience. So I also just wanted to make sure we're framing that as much as we're going to be talking about some history in some different areas. And yes, some of that comes from research, just even acknowledging that a lot of this research is even starting to get out there because of people with lived experiences who have, made those of us who, come from more of that like medicalized model background, have to really take a deep look inward, and see what we're missing. And there's still a lot of gaps. But anyway, I just also wanted to like set the frame for that before we talk about some history stuff. So yeah, I'll just hand it over to you, Jody, and then we'll just kind of go back and forth from
All
there.
right. Okay. Okay, where do I start? I think it's important to, like, especially when we're in therapy, to have somebody who can relate to this lived experience. Like, I mean, I know there's professional limitations on disclosure and things like that, but sometimes it's those me too moments between the autistic client or the adopted client and the therapist that can, oh wow, that can make or break the therapeutic relationship. And it's the relationship that matters more than whatever methods and counseling practices. Like, I mean, it's if we think that the people we're trying to talk with who say they want to help us don't understand where we're coming from, the therapy is generally not going to be that successful. And I mean, I think it's great to have more neurodivergent people working in therapeutic fields, because we can tell the higher up professionals that you guys don't, with all due respect and all that, the approach that we've used for our autistic clients hasn't worked and has actually done more harm than good. And the same with the adopted clients. Maybe, listen to us and change our approach and sort of thing. Like, when I've been in and out of therapy since I was 5 years old, and I didn't get a whole lot of that lived experience understanding. And I mean, it was a long time ago, but I think that I would like to be in the position to better help others understand there's nothing, you're not alone in what you're going through as a result of adoption trauma or neurodivergence. This is not a, you're not alone. And I think that should be at the heart of therapy, is reassuring people that they're not alone. Their lived experience matters, and it's not, we're going to explore what happened to you instead of trying to figure out what's wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. And I think to build off of that, Jody, just like also trying to provide that frame, or I do, for people with neurodivergence. And I know you all can't like see the shirt I'm wearing, but it's my new favorite shirt. Some of my friends / other psychologists got me, that says like normalize all kinds of minds. And so just with all individuals, just going back to this idea of like, even though we have this idea of like what is quote unquote typical or not typical. I don't even know that I believe that neurotypical exists, but that's probably a totally another topic. But just setting the frame of like, not only are you not alone in this, but also like, this is not something that's bad about you or wrong about you. And, unfortunately, the medical model uses so much like deficit-based terms rather than acknowledging like, this is just a natural part of human diversity. And so I really try to set that frame with people, because while I know some things have changed since you probably went through therapy when you were 5. I would imagine that unfortunately not very much has changed also, and that there's
Right.
still so much work to be done. And so unfortunately some of the experiences that you had as a child at age 5 could unfortunately still be going on for other individuals who have similar lived experiences for
It's,
you.
yeah, it's important that we don't re-traumatize people in therapy either. And the messages that we can get from people who don't know any better because they had the medical model taught that we are missing some essential puzzle piece in our brains, that until, I I agree with normalizing everything, because whatever somebody's lived experience is, whether that's considered abnormal in the medical or the psychological field, that is their normal. This is my normal. And to treat a client like something in them is inherently broken and needs to be fixed is not going to, it's not going to help them. It's not going to help people around them. And it's just a, yeah. I've been thinking a lot about the symbols used to represent the different marginalized populations. Like the puzzle piece with autism is absolutely toxic.
Mhm.
And like, we're not missing a piece in our brains. We don't need to be fixed. And the puzzle piece is blue because people thought that only boys could be autistic. And that's unfortunately the mentality that a lot of medical professionals had when I was 5 or 6 years old back in the late 70s. And unless you were completely non-speak and whacking your head against the wall, if you were a girl especially, you didn't get diagnosed autistic. They thought it was something else. They didn't know. I have pages and pages of my own records from the Child Diagnostic Center, the psychologists and psychiatrists that I saw, all these diagnostic professionals who didn't know what to call what I had. And I'm glad things have evolved enough that now I finally have a word for what's going on. But to have lived 40 years without that medical diagnosis is just, we need to do better.
Mhm. Yeah, no, we definitely do. And that's why I'm so grateful that there's, individuals like you who are willing to speak up and, let, just like be in dialogue together. And we can have, these conversations and how you can bring things up to me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's another layer that we need to like peel off. And I think that's so much of
Right.
as like we've been in conversation with each other, it's like, oh, here's another layer, like here's another layer, and how just just with the intersecting identities, there's just so much, like shame, or I think so much as we have discussed, like so much just blame put on children, and it can't possibly be the adults in their life that might be doing something, or that we need to have a change in their environment or different like accommodations and needs. So while certainly not to like say that all the experiences are like all similar and there's not differences in it, but I know we spent a lot of time talking about how there can be that convergence of when we have some behaviors that might be seen as baffling or not understandable, that it tends to be something that another individual is doing.
Yeah.
So rather than how can we kind of like change or modify our, the environment around an individual, we're putting so much blame and shame on top of what they're already feeling.
Right. And when we reframe those behaviors in the context of developmental trauma, I mean, what autistic kid didn't go through some kind of trauma in school? Because we're always the target for the class bully. And, we get sent to the principal's office for fighting back. And the principal says things like, well, there's this thing called fishing. You don't have to take the bait. What am I supposed to do? Oh, just ignore them and they'll stop. When has ignoring a bully ever made them stop? And why is it on the autistic or ADHD or traumatized individual to magically regulate themselves enough not to respond to triggers? And in the context of developmental trauma, I mean, we need to acknowledge that for adopted kids, especially being removed from their mother at a very young age, maybe taken from their family, maybe displaced to another country, is a highly traumatic event. Being raised by strangers you don't resemble is embedded complex trauma, because every morning you wake up and these strangers who don't look like you and don't act like you and don't think like you are still there. And they're just as determined not to understand you as they were the day before. And I think that's where when the convergence of autism and adoption trauma is that these people don't share the genetic condition that makes your brain work the way it does. And see, if my mother had raised me, my behaviors would not have been as confusing to her, and there wouldn't have been so many of those behaviors either, but she wouldn't have made me go outside without dark glasses. She wouldn't have made me stay in social situations that were highly uncomfortable for me, and she wouldn't have she wouldn't have sent me to therapists at 5 years old because I wasn't bonding with her. And that's the number one reason why the woman who adopted me had me in therapy, is because, in her words, I wasn't bonding with her or her husband. And in addition to all this switching off, shutting down, which is basically autistic dissociation, where trauma flight, the only way I could, I escaped into my brain because I couldn't get away from them. And when I didn't find those papers until my aunt who adopted me died, and I was 36 at the time, but I was going through her files and I found these papers, and I was like, wow, this makes for some interesting reading. And I was up all night reading that stuff. I couldn't stop. And it kept nagging at my brain that there's something else going on here. There's something they didn't pick up on. And I don't know what it is, but I'm going to try to figure it out. And of course, I knew enough by then that I started figuring things out on my own. This sounds a lot like autism, ADHD, and maybe both. I don't know. But, with complex adoption trauma on top of it. And the more I learned about my own background, the more I wondered how anybody could expect me to bond with these two people I didn't meet till I was almost 2 years old. And when I did, it was under highly traumatic circumstances.
Mhm.
And I got so frustrated at the adults in my life who hadn't picked up on that, and at my aunt who tried to force a bond that didn't exist and could never exist because I wasn't hardwired to attach to her the way I had to my mother. And maybe it's my logical autistic brain, whatever, that she didn't give birth to me, therefore she's not my mother. But I wondered why they made such unrealistic demands of me, and why they blamed me when I wasn't what they wanted or what they expected.
And I think that makes me think of, a few things in terms of just, at least, and I can only speak for my experience, but I think as I was going through grad school, like just us not having enough discussions and understanding about about all of these things in general. So let's just put that out there. And
Right.
I, did not graduate all that long ago. I graduated in 2014. But I think just the piece of, as you were talking, like a few things I thought about as we've discussed, like just that, this idea of like, that there must be something wrong with a kid if like it doesn't feel safe for them to connect with people, or there's not, this safety going on. And sometimes me having to work with, um, maybe some foster care parents just to like get them curious, if they'll say things like, well, I'm a safe person, why can't they understand it? And so I'm like, okay, let's step back. Like you might think that you're a safe person, but you don't actually get to decide that because they've had a lot of unsafe people in their life. So like you have to earn that you're a safe person. And like that's how I feel with everyone I work with. Like I have to earn the belief that I can provide them with some level of safety. Like that's just not something that I'm like, oh, you can talk to me because I'm a feelings doctor. Like, and that's supposed to make it all okay. And so I think, for me, like I'm always thinking about what's the level of like felt safety or not felt safety there. But then like I'm also just constantly thinking about like the double empathy problem and how, for as much as we, I think some of like the myths of, with neurodivergent individuals, especially I hear this with autistic individuals, which is a load of crap. I'll say that a little bit nicer than I usually would for this audience. But just that idea that I hear that like, oh, autistic people, they can't be empathetic, they can't be caring, they don't want to connect to anyone. Just all these like terrible myths, or how they're so rigid. Like, why can't they just compromise? And then sometimes well, but how much do you as a neurotypical individual compromise, or how much of this conversation when you're asking them to change is perhaps not also demonstrating the exact things that you're like finding some issues and difficulty with? So I think, I always, as much as I can, like try to bring that up to individuals of like, that idea, and kind of, as you said, like, they didn't have a brain that worked the same way as you. And so just this idea that like there's one right way for a brain, or like why do we do things like have small talk all the time? Like the idea of like we just can't get in and get into it, like life is very short. Or these ideas of like someone is not respecting me if they're not giving me eye contact. Like I will never make anyone give me eye contact if they don't want to. But yeah, I just think with that double empathy problem, like just reminding ourselves, for as much as we like to say like, oh, autistic, ADHDers, otherwise neurodivergent folks, or even, adoptee or adopted persons, and some of their behaviors like aren't acting how they're supposed to, but like how much of that is also neurotypical people not always practicing what they preach, or seeing their own blinders, or
Right.
how
Yeah.
something like, I've worked with individuals that they're adopted, not adopted, kind of across the span. With some of my autistic youth will say that like, oh, my parent's a liar, and that can be very triggering for their parent. But when you ask them that, they'll say, well, they told me this was the rule, but they don't follow the rule. And parents will say like, well, but that's the rule because you're a teenager and we're adults, so we can do what we want, so like you're not
Right.
allowed to
Yeah.
call us liars. And I'm like, well, but
Yeah.
in the way that your child's brain works, like, yes,
Right.
you are a liar. So I think sometimes really needing to break down that it's not always, neurodivergent people who aren't good at communicating, or just even, I can't remember the exact research that it was, but they did a study where it was like they had individuals play, the game of telephone, as you're like passing a message along. And they
Mhm.
had one group of just autistic individuals, one group of neurotypical, or at least assumed to be neurotypical
Mhm.
individuals, and then a mixed group. And so in the mixed group, like everything fell apart. Like the message just totally, got out of control, wasn't transmitted in the way that it started. But in each of the separate groups, everybody did fine. So to demonstrate that it's not, again, that autistic individuals have difficulty with communication, they do
Right.
very well. Or
Oh
this
yeah.
can also be with ADHDers, like when they are around people with whom they share, kind of some shared brain experiences, some shared experiences in general. And of course, I always say, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, but there's like more
Exactly.
commonality there,
Right.
that they can really engage and connect. So this idea of, one of those myths of like they can't or don't want to connect, is just not true. And I think, kind of brings me back to that like idea of safety. Like they're
Right.
maybe not doing the things that you think they quote unquote should, because you're not a safe person for them. Like you're
Right.
not showing that, oh, like my authentic self is not going to be okay here. I need to mask, or, like you said, kind of like go into myself and maybe, just be in a daydream world, dissociate, or go into that like fawning people pleasing to be acceptable for you. And so that's not
Right.
going to feel authentic and like a way that you can build a true connection with someone.
Yeah, like what you said too about the double standard of I can lie to you, but you have to tell me the truth and nothing but the truth. So, the people who adopted me, I was old enough to know that, yeah, they're not my parents. I didn't even meet them till I was almost 2. I would ask questions about, who are my parents? Where did I come from? And all that. How did you get me? And I was, I just wanted to know my own origin story like any kid would. And they'd never give me a straight answer on anything. And I was frustrated. I had this feeling that she knew more than she was saying. The same way as I knew that she was the one to ask because she brought me over from England along with her mother. And he was actually surprised when he went to pick her up at the airport and saw me with her, because apparently she failed to tell him that she was bringing me back from England with her. But I I always I always knew she was holding something back from me. She wasn't telling me the truth, and that was probably why I had no qualms about being dishonest with her or not telling her everything, where I was going or who I was with or anything like that. You want to keep secrets from me, I'm going to keep secrets from you. And the older I got, the more curious I got. I was in 5th grade and we had to do this it wasn't the dreaded family tree assignment, but it was the history of your name. And it was like, okay, well, who named you? Where did your name come from? Do you have a middle name? Whatever. And I didn't know. I had no idea who would name me. Kids are laughing at me. The teacher's like, well, obviously your parents named you. And I was like, but I don't know who my parents are. And I did really badly that year. I got there was one kid in the class that just singled me out for bullying and was using me as a punching bag and kicking me every chance he got. And the teacher was no better. Like, she'd ridicule me in front of the class about things, and she never did anything to make the bully stop. And that was when my identity crisis really began. I was like, well, who did name me, and why? Who are my parents? Where are my parents? And I always read way ahead of my age. I was reading chapter books in kindergarten. And I'd read about other adopted kids, and some of them ended up finding their parents and learning where they came from and all that. And I wanted to know. I needed to know, because the people I lived with, I didn't even know how they got their hands on me, because they were in their mid to late 40s when I was born. It was like being raised by very strict grandparents, only they didn't have any experience raising kids of their own. And when she finally admitted that the Uncle George she'd been making me write to for as long as I could remember was actually my dad, not my uncle, I was like, I felt horribly betrayed. Like, why didn't you tell me sooner? You've been my aunt all along. Why didn't you just raise me as your niece all along, instead of lying to me and making me think my actual father was some faraway uncle I'd never met? And if I had had any trust in her up to that point, it was completely shattered. And I read about betrayal trauma when I was taking feminist counseling classes. And I finally had a word for what she'd done to me all those years ago. And I think betrayal trauma is extremely common among adoptees, because it's, people you're very close to, like in a living situation, when you're raised by people who lie to you and are continually dishonest with you, and when you find out the truth, how can you not feel betrayed? How can you not distrust the people who raised you? Especially when they knew all along who and where your parents were, and they didn't respect you enough to tell you. Adoption doesn't respect children, and it doesn't respect when those children become adults.
Yeah, I think I've seen that, and we've talked about it a little bit, Jody, or in conversation with Brooke as well, when parents will be like, oh, well, but you can't tell them they're adopted because they don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, that's going to be a goal for treatment. That's going to be included in my recommendations, because there's this idea that, right, you have to be this magical number to know when, what you're sharing is like, you knew something was off. So just this idea oftentimes, and I think it's in the experience when anyone, kind of feels like they might be outside of, whatever the norms or, perceived norms are, or there's a uniqueness. I think I always try to tell, parents or even other providers that I work with that, yeah, just like you said, like in that trying to somehow, like, you've shielded them. Are you really shielding them? Are you shielding yourself from
Yourself,
trying to have that conversation? And
right?
also, just like you said, because I'm like, what do you think that's going to do to the relationship? Like you're saying, if your child finds out at age 14, 15, 16, that they are adopted and you
Right.
never shared this information. Or what if someone somehow tells them before,
Yeah.
you were ready to discuss it, or they discover some information. So I think that sometimes this idea that we seem to have in society, like they have to be a certain age to be able to know and handle it, where there would be so many questions that could be answered sooner.
Right.
And I think that even like in terms of parallels, like sometimes I'll have parents be like, well, how do we tell them that they're autistic? And I'm like, we just tell
Tell them,
them that they're autistic.
because they already know.
Yeah, they know
They
something is
they
different
already
and
know they're
going
not.
on. Yeah.
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 And I
And then
think,
like
yeah.
the way we just say it is like, hey, kiddo, like Johnny, let's say, like, remember how you and I were discussing like XYZ? Like, it seems that your brain neurotype is consistent with what we, call an autism identification. But yeah, I often say to parents, like, your child knows, like, and even
Oh
if they're
yeah.
not saying it, like some of this, anxiety that is externalizing, like there's a knowingness that they have. And so if we hide this from them, or also just pretend like it's something that needs to be hidden, as if it's, I know with a lot of the myths and a lot of the history that there was so much just blame for parents, because of autism, or, the whole like terrible refrigerator mom idea,
Yeah.
or that, somehow people did something wrong. So I understand, or gosh, there's the adult autism assessment handbook, and there were some like disgustingly terrible flyers that I didn't realize like went around, I think in like the 90s in New York, that
Mhm.
basically was, trying to equate it to like I think there was one that was, basically a parent saying like autism ruined their life. And so I can understand with these like terrible, horrible misinformation how you can think that, but it's like your child already knows, they're already feeling shame. And so,
Right.
yes, there's going to be some challenges, but there's a lot of things that they're good at. And how can we help teach them this now so they can build up that self-identity along the way, rather than feeling like everything is crumbling and there's no one there to support them in that self-identity journey.
Right. And like you were saying, the kids already know when they we may not know that we're autistic, but we know that our brains don't work the same way as normal people. And a lot of late discovery adoptees have said the same thing. Like they didn't always know they were adopted. At least that's one thing that my aunt and uncle did, is they told me from the beginning that I was adopted, but they didn't tell me that they were my aunt and uncle. So they only told me half the story. But even people who didn't find out they were adopted until much later in life, they often knew. Like it was, in some ways it was a shock to the system, but in other ways it just confirmed what they had suspected for most of their lives. Like, I don't look like anybody else in the family. I have this condition that nobody else in the family has, or everybody else in the family dealt with this and I didn't. And I'm not like them. I don't match them. I've always felt like the odd one out. Well, here's why.
Mm-hmm.
The trouble is that our imagination can come up with so many worse things than whatever the truth turns out to be. And
Mm-hmm.
as you said, a lot of adopters are shielding themselves from having these difficult conversations. It's not that they're shielding the child from the stigma of being adopted. They're holding all the power and they're keeping all the secrets because they don't want to have to tell this kid that they have another set of parents somewhere. They have a whole other family somewhere else, and they may want to go find them. Ooh, horrors.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah,
no.
or like, right, that you have to be that magical age to get the information. Like sometimes we'll hear like, well, they know they're adopted, but we're gonna wait till they're 18. And I'm like, what magically happens at 18 that makes them ready? Like, how
Yeah.
are we going to prepare them? Like, why is this nothing that we're gonna talk about for all the potential scenarios of like what could happen if they do decide that they want to go on this search? And I think it just, yeah, it just goes back to like that, the betrayal and like the concerns about abandonment that, yeah, and then cause you to kind of either withdraw into yourself or again like maybe do some fawning or people pleasing responses or just even like in reading, a little bit about like rejection sensitivity dysphoria and how that can go on. Like, I mean, of course, we're
Right.
all primed to want to connect in some way with someone, and for you, it was like knowing that there are these people that I share this link with. And so it's
Right.
incredibly confusing when you don't have that. And then if you have people, you're already feeling like there is something that is different about me or different from me and my family, different in my peers, like all these feelings of rejection and shame that are already there that are then just, reinforced in other ways, and just kind of continue to unfortunately like build and build on each other. And then, I just think it also makes me think about like the punishment and the punitiveness that can sometimes be there when, you can't like hold in all of your feelings of, feeling isolated or abandoned or betrayed or just very confused and needing something and not knowing how to express yourself. And then, then you get labeled with like oppositional defiant disorder instead of like, hey, this is an anxiety response going on, or,
This is a meltdown.
yeah. They're just at complete overload. And rather than have compassion for it, sometimes we're just like, oh, they're just being defiant. Like they purposely want to hurt people. Or, I think as you and I discussed too, it gets so messy because it can be like bi-directional, and that the trauma can mask that there's, whether it's autism or ADHD or some other neurodivergence going on. Or, kind of the opposite because, sorry, I just got a comment. I mean, I'm still learning about PDA, bro. But yes, but yeah, that idea of like the window of tolerance. And I mean, I prefer for many of you on this call might know like PDA, I don't love that it's called pathological demand avoidance. So I like to use the term of like pervasive drive for autonomy. And that idea of, or even like in a testing psychologist Facebook thread, like a bunch of us had to get on there and introduce the idea, like it's a kiddo who has some known learning differences, and they were like, just has these episodes when like tears things up and there's like no empathy, but like well liked by peers, like, but so I think I'm gonna have to diagnose ODD. And all of us were like, why do you have to do that? Like the window of tolerance, like what can we do in terms of accommodations? Like, yes, there's accommodations in school, but maybe we have to, and like PDA versus ODD could be its whole other thing. But yes, I just think this idea of like that idea of kids can't handle knowing the truth, but we can pathologize and label their behavior as their bad kid as if there's not already enough shame and terrible feelings for them. So they're not too young to have, us just like minimize their experience, but they're too young to know the truth about themselves. So
why does
is it?
Yeah, why does the diagnosis have to be on the autistic or adopted child? rather than on the adults in their lives who are making unreasonable demands and placing unmeetable expectations on them.
I don't know if you can see it, Jody, but you're getting some very enthusiastic, like loving it moments. So I know you can't always see it. So I just want to give you, your flowers and let you know that there are some people on this call that just really, really loved what you were saying. And I could not agree more with you.
Yeah. Like, it's not the autistic kid who is pathological. It's the demands made on them that are pathological. It's like, okay, extremely vulnerable moment here. I can't see out of my left eye. It would be like coming up to me on my left side and going like this. Why? Look at me, look at me. And I'd be like, no, I can't see you. Well, there is nothing you can say and nothing you can do that is going to make me see out of my left eye. Same with, there's nothing they can, you're going to have to change your approach to me by coming around on my right side, or I can see you, and then, then I'll pay attention to you. But I am not going to see what is outside of my field of vision. And if a kid struggles to read, or struggles with math, or struggles with instructions, maybe we need to reframe our approach to this child. And they're not learning the way we're teaching them. So are we going to punish them for not learning, or are we going to change our approach and make sure they can see where we're coming from?
And I think so much, again, like I can only speak for my experience, but I feel like that was such a huge piece that was missing. And so I'd be lying if I said I wasn't like taught to give diagnoses of ODD and conduct disorder, and never did, because that would just be a blatant lie. But once, thankfully, again, people like you and so many others with lived experience that got me finally questioning, like, wait, why do we do this? This makes no sense. And oftentimes now I'm comfortable saying to people, like, because, I think sometimes then it's, well, are you condoning these things? And it's like, no, I'm not condoning it. But to go back to something you said like earlier before, like, I want to know why it's happening. I don't really care so much about the what, like, why is it happening? And so to label it as this bad behavior, or, I know that me and Brooke feel pretty strongly about RAD, and I will not, again, that's one of those, I was taught to give that diagnosis. But thankfully I now no longer do. But as we've talked about in discussions, like how it seems, or I will just speak for what I've seen as a professional, how it seems that we are not really taught as professionals. Like somehow we've just forgotten that like part of the DSM that says like you have to rule out autism before you're going to consider diagnosing RAD. And so I've seen like that come up as like a hot button topic sometimes in different psychologist groups, and being like, well, I don't know, maybe RAD to best explain it, but I think it might be autism. And I'm like, if you have any inkling that it might be autism, don't diagnose RAD. Just don't do it. Or reminding people that there's like the other specified trauma and stressor relator identification, and how you can utilize that to capture developmental trauma, because Lord knows I have no idea when we're going to get it together as a psychology community and get developmental trauma in the DSM. I'm not holding my breath on that one. And also, I think I had told you that like in conversation with other psychologists, like some of whom work with other folks who are neurodivergent, or are, have some neurodivergence themselves, us talking about how like that other specified category can also be a way to capture that autistic burnout, autistic overwhelm, which I think can also happen, with ADHD, with other, medical or mental health conditions, because in my opinion, the DSM criteria for PTSD is just, it's very narrow. It doesn't capture all the ways in which we live in the world, and things can be
Right.
traumatizing, especially when it's a world that you don't feel like was created for you, or there's stigma around it, or like, how is relational trauma not under there yet?
Right.
And how there is so much, not only early developmental trauma for either, adoptees or individuals who are neurodivergent or suspect that they are, but just,
Right.
yeah, just the
Like
ways it
even,
just continues to compact the bullying, the invalidation, and you being told like, oh, just ignore it, just deal with it. And how that makes it even more difficult to understand, how do I navigate and
yeah,
survive and feel safety in my world?
right. The message that sends is that any abuse and bullying you get is your own fault. I grew up believing I was a magnet for abuse, and it was the same way with the male adopter. Um, he was an extremely harsh, abusive man. He had a bad temper and he used to drink a lot. Like he'd come home from work and he'd go straight to the liquor cabinet and he'd pour drinks for him. He'd pour drinks for my aunt. And basically you know, his favorite thing to do other than drinking was yelling at me. And I can't even repeat a lot of the things that he said to me, but he used to call me the R word. And I learned to run and hide when I heard him taking off his belt. And I never once heard her tell him to leave me alone. She never told him to stop. She never told him to lay off. She'd yell that she got sick of refereeing the fights, but she never did one thing to make him stop. And I used to wish those two would get divorced so that I would never have to see him again. I mean, I didn't want to live with her either, but and she was a narcissist too, so it's still hard to say which one was the lesser of two evils, but he had no problem with frightening me. And here we go again. We're not blank slates. My mother left my father after a domestic violence episode when I was about 4 months old. And I I was always frightened of people shouting and raising their voices at me. And both of the adopters used to shout at me on a regular basis. It's like, oh, she didn't hear me the first time, I'm going to yell at her. And I don't know whether it's sensory processing differences, because I really can't stand loud, shrill, sudden noises. I have an extremely high startle reflex, but I can't stand listening to people shouting at me. I mean, I got to get out of there. The flight response kicks in, and I can't be around that. And nobody knew, so nobody tried to make things any easier for me.
And then just not even to mention, like, just right, the confusing messages that we get as children or people in society all the time. Like, I don't know, but I would imagine if, or wonder if this was true for you, Jody, right? They could scream at you as much as they wanted, but then it's like, that do as I say, not as I do. Like, you're the one that's going to get in trouble. And then that's like another way of, right? Or I think it happens to kids regardless of, just any kids that might come from like hard, difficult kind of situations, that, that they're somehow expected to have more emotional capacity than the adults in their life and keep it together, and they snap. And it, yeah, again, is something terrible about them, when it's like, how much are we supposed to expect one person to take before any of us could break?
Right. And I'm in a lot of autism groups, just, autistic people getting together, talking about all their common experiences, basically. But there's educational threads about, autistic kids having meltdowns when they get home from school because they've been holding it in all day and being told what to do and criticized and corrected and bullied and everything by, you know, other kids and by their teachers and everybody. And it's finally safe for them to vent when they get home. Well, guess what? It wasn't safe for me to vent when I got home.
Yeah.
So I think I held it in for, yeah, I had meltdowns. I remember exploding because I just couldn't keep it inside any longer. But I get bullied at school and I get picked on by the adopters. So I would just go for a long run and get away from everybody. And that's how I dealt with stuff because I didn't have any other outlet or safe place or anything. My being just about blind in my left eye was what caused them to send me to schools 5 miles away from where we lived. I didn't make friends in the neighborhood because I didn't go to school in the neighborhood. I couldn't make friends at school because I wasn't allowed to go home with anybody after school. They made me ride the short bus to and from school, and nothing says stigma like riding the short bus. And yeah, like kids at school didn't want to hang out with me because I rode the bus with the handicapped kids. So obviously there must be something wrong with me too. And I don't think they could have isolated me any more than they did. Like it wouldn't have been possible. Most of their friends didn't have kids. There were one or two who had kids of their own, but most of their friends were in the same age bracket and didn't have kids. So they didn't know how to be a kid.
Yeah. I think just even when you talked about at school, like I think about how often like individuals that I work with who experience sensory processing, or like even for me, I know sound is like a big aversion for me. And sometimes I just can't you know, really think when any of that is going on, but just not to mention and just the sensory piece and how I feel like that is so missed and so not considered, and how that's just another piece that then people are told like, oh, don't be so dramatic, like it wasn't that loud, or like I didn't touch you that hard, or
right, but you still touched me and I didn't say you could touch me.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, how some of those things then just cause you to kind of like mask and then not trust yourself. And then gosh, that could be a whole other behavior about how that could potentially set our conversation about how that can set individuals up for some like grooming or even more risk of victimization if we just tell them like, oh, you have to let these people do things for you.
It is. It's grooming for abuse, and it's gaslighting. And when I first found out that if I wore dark glasses, the bright lights didn't hurt as much, I felt so much more comfortable. So my aunt tried to make me wear regular glasses, and for some reason they made everything brighter because they didn't do anything for my extreme light sensitivity. I was always looking down, and for a long time I thought it was just, low self-esteem, whatever. But what if I was avoiding the lights all along? What if I was avoiding the overhead lights? And these are things that we're supposed to figure out for ourselves. The lights are too bright, I need to do something about it. Wear dark glasses. But then you're told to not trust your own perception of reality, that no, the lights are fine, it's not too bright.
Yeah, or that makes me think before we like maybe get ready to move into some Q&A, Jody, I just wanted to build upon that for other people, and I will put Sunny's name in the info to everyone, but Sunny Jane Wise she's on, I follow her on, or I follow them, sorry, on LinkedIn, or some other like Facebook. I think they're on Instagram as well. But they had kind of brought up the point about how, there are so many times like funds for raising money for people to participate in therapy, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And Sunny was saying that as well. But like, what if we had funds for people in which it was like, oh, we're going to help fund you so you can get noise canceling headphones, or right? Like if you could find, glasses or things like that. So just trying to think of like some of those community ways that we can help out. But I know we had so much we wanted to talk about, Jody. We probably just started to scratch the surface.
Well, maybe we
could talk about it so much longer, but yeah, do we want to see if there's any questions?